you already know something is wrong. You don't need a PhD. You don't need a Bloomberg terminal. You need a grocery receipt from 2019 and one from last Tuesday, and the math does itself. The government says inflation's around 2.5%, maybe 3%. The official CPI headline rate has been hovering around 2.7%. Totally under control, totally normal. And yet, your weekly grocery bill feels like it's funding a small military operation. Households right now are reporting spending an average of $133 a week just on groceries. And here's the thing, you are not imagining it. You're not bad at math. You're not emotionally irrational about prices. The number is just wrong. Not wrong because someone made a mistake. Wrong because someone made a choice. Two choices, actually. One in 1983, one in 1990. And those two quiet bureaucratic decisions permanently lowered what the government calls inflation forever, while your actual cost of living kept climbing like it always did. That's what this video is about, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at a CPI headline the same way again. Let's start with the official story, because the official story is actually pretty reasonable on the surface. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, is the government's main tool for measuring inflation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, sends people out to track the prices of a basket of goods and services every month. Food, housing, energy, healthcare, cars, clothes. They track the changes.
They publish a number. That number then controls your Social Security cost of living adjustment. It influences Fed interest rate decisions. It determines whether your employer's inflation raise actually keeps up with reality. It is, functionally, the most important economic number that most people have never read the methodology for. And that's where this gets interesting, because the methodology has been rewritten multiple times, and every single time it was rewritten, the resulting number got lower. Now, the BLS will tell you, and they're not entirely wrong, that the methodology improved, that the old way was flawed. And here's where I need you to hold two thoughts at once, because this isn't a simple government bad story. It's more uncomfortable than that. It's a story where the methodology changes were arguably defensible in isolation, but the cumulative effect was that the number the government reports has drifted further and further from what you actually experience at a checkout counter. And to understand how that happened, you have to understand 1983. Before 1983, the way the government measured housing costs was, frankly, pretty straightforward. If you owned a home, the CPI tracked what you actually paid, your mortgage payments, your property taxes, your insurance, maintenance, the purchase price itself, real costs, costs you wrote checks for. Housing inflation pre-1983 was measured in a way that captured house prices, mortgage interest rates, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs as inputs. Made sense. That's what home ownership costs. But here's where it starts to break. That old shelter measure received a full 26.1% of the weight of the entire headline CPI. That's more than a quarter of the index. And because mortgage rates in the late 1970s and early 80s were absolutely catastrophic, we're talking 15, 16, 17%, that measure was making CPI look enormous. Politically, that was a problem. And here's how they solved it. Meet the OER, Owner's Equivalent Rent. In 1983, the BLS switched to a new method, where instead of tracking what homeowners actually paid, they started estimating how much the homeowner would have received if they were renting their home from a hypothetical landlord. Read that again. Instead of measuring what you spend, they started measuring what you imagine you would earn. It's a survey. They call homeowners and ask, if you were going to rent your home, what do you think you'd charge? And that hypothetical number, that fiction, now comprises the single largest component of CPI. Since the 1983 shift, shelter CPI has become much less volatile and much more correlated with rent CPI, which sounds like a feature. But here's the consequence you're going to want to remember for later in this video. When home prices spike, when mortgage rates double, like they did between 2021 and 2023, the OER barely moves. Because it's not measuring what buyers actually pay. It's measuring what renters might pay. The real cost of acquiring a home became invisible to the index.
And that gap between what OER reports and what homebuyers actually experience is part of why the number feels so disconnected from your life. But to understand why the 1983 change was only half the story, you first have to understand what they did to the math in 1990. Because this second change is quieter, more technical, and in some ways more consequential because it applies to every single category, not just housing. In 1990, the BLS began incorporating what they called the substitution effect into CPI calculations. The logic goes like this. If the price of beef goes up, consumers will buy chicken instead. So we shouldn't measure the cost of beef, we should measure the cost of whatever you're eating now. And they argued this was more accurate because it reflected real consumer behavior. The commission identified upward bias in the CPI from failure to account for consumer substitutions, such as buying more chicken when beef prices increase. This sounds reasonable until you think about what it actually measures. It doesn't measure your standard of living. It measures your adaptation to a declining standard of living. You downgraded. The index called it no change. This was then formalized in 1999 when the BLS introduced the geometric mean formula across roughly 61% of consumer spending categories. Effective January 1999, the BLS introduced the geometric mean estimator for index categories comprising approximately 61% of total consumer spending. The difference between the old arithmetic mean and the new geometric mean is technical, but the effect is simple. The BLS concluded that adopting the geometric mean formula would reduce measured inflation by about 2 percentage points annually. The Boskin Commission, the advisory panel that pushed these changes, estimated that the old methodology had an upward bias of 1.1 percentage points per year. Backing out the methods implemented in the 1990s by the BLS puts inflation at meaningfully higher rates than the headline number suggests. And this is where the story escalates, because we're not talking about one tweak. We're talking about a stack of methodological changes. Housing in 1983, substitution in the 1990s, geometric weighting in 1999. Each one individually defensible, each one making the number go down, and the cumulative effect landing on the number you see on the news today. The number that says everything is basically fine.
And this is where the gap between the official number and your lived experience enters the story. Because it isn't just a vibe. It's measurable. It's documented, and it has a very specific shape. Here's the thing about the perception gap. Economists have a slightly condescending term for it. They say consumers are just bad at estimating inflation. They're emotionally anchored to salient price increases like eggs and gas, but they forget when prices on other things fall. And there's some truth to that. But here's what the data actually shows. Consumers in survey data reported food inflation of 5.4% for 2025, well above the official estimate of 2.7% for food at home. Now, you can dismiss that as consumer psychology, but consider this. 82% of American consumers modified their grocery shopping behavior in 2025 because of economic pressure. That is not the behavior of people living in a 2.7% inflation environment. U.S. food prices are still up roughly 19% since 2022. 19% in 3 years. And the headline rate says we've basically fixed it. What you're seeing is the difference between the rate of change, which has slowed, and the cumulative price level, which hasn't come back down. Inflation moderating to 3% doesn't mean prices dropped. It means they're still rising, just more slowly. Your purchasing power from 2020 is gone. It did not return because the Fed hiked rates. The CPI just stopped counting the damage as fast. And that's the real buried mechanism that nobody on financial television has the airtime or the incentive to explain to you. So let's bring this all together. The CPI is not a lie, exactly, but it's not measuring your life. It's measuring a model of consumer behavior that was designed, starting in 1983, accelerating through the 1990s, to produce a number that was less volatile, more politically manageable, and mathematically lower than the number it replaced. The methodological innovation understandably sets off alarm bells because the new method strips away actual costs and replaces them with hypothetical estimates. The OER removed real housing costs and replaced them with a survey. The substitution effect removed the assumption that you maintain your standard of living and replaced it with the assumption that you adapt downward. The geometric mean math knocked off another fraction of a point. Stack those changes over 40 years and you have a number that says inflation is tame, while housing costs are rising at 4.1% per year and medical care at 2.9% per year, and your grocery bill hasn't felt 2.7% since before the pandemic. There are alternative measures. Shadow Stats uses the pre-1980 methodology and has historically shown inflation running significantly higher. The MIT Billion Prices Project tracked real-time retail prices. Neither is perfect, but the fact that multiple independent methodologies consistently show higher inflation than the BLS suggests this isn't a data error. It's a design feature. You were right to be skeptical. The number was built to be low, and now you know exactly how.